Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
The sun set like it always did in Brookhaven Ridge, painting the charred peaks in hues of red and gold, as though the land itself bled for the lives lost. I watched it from the rooftop of our compound, the evening before everything went to hell. It was my routine 5 minutes alone away from the team. They didn't mind. Leo being Leo, they'd say, shrugging it off. But I needed that silence, even if it couldn't drown out the ghosts of past missions. My team was in high spirits that night. Ethan was showing off pictures of his baby girl, born just 3 weeks earlier. "She's got my ears," he laughed. Poor kid. Connor and James were arguing about some dumb movie they'd watched on a bootleg DVD. Doc Carter was in the corner, writing a letter to his wife. I still remember the way they laughed. The sound echoes in my head, a cruel contrast to the screams that followed less than 24 hours later. The mission was simple, too simple. A routine sweep to secure intel on a high-value target hiding in a village we'd hit a dozen times before. I should have seen the signs the way the locals scattered earlier than usual, the absence of kids playing soccer in the dust. But we were tired. Complacency had crept in like a thief, and in our line of work, complacency is a death sentence. We were halfway through the village when the first explosion ripped through the air, an IED buried under a pile of trash. Connor and James went down instantly. Before the dust settled, gunfire erupted from every direction. It was a setup. We fought back, of course, that's what we did, but they had the high ground, the numbers, and the intel. They knew our route, our timings. Every movement we made was met with precision. Ethan took a round to the chest while dragging Connor to cover. Doc Carter didn't stop working on him, even when shrapnel tore through his own leg. He bled out beside Ethan, his hands still clutching gauze he never got to use. I don't remember when I got hit. It was all a blur of noise, smoke, and pain. I went down behind a crumbling wall, gripping my side where blood poured out like a faucet. They left me for dead. Recovery wasn't just physical. The wounds on my body healed faster than the scars in my mind. I spent weeks in a sterile hospital bed, replaying every decision, every step, wondering what I could have done differently. Survivor's guilt, they called it. Hell, I didn't need a fancy term to know I was broken. The day I was discharged, I handed in my resignation. The army tried to keep me. My CO called me into his office, said all the right things. "You're a hero, Leo. You've still got a lot to give." But what did they know? I couldn't face the idea of going back into the field without my brothers. Now I'm back stateside. The world here feels alien. The streets are too quiet, the people too oblivious. I've traded desert fatigues for a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt, the sound of gunfire for the hum of a pickup truck engine. I bought a small place out in the Elmwood foothills, far from the noise of the city. At night, I sit on the porch and stare at the stars, trying to find the ones we saw in the Middle East. Sometimes, I think I hear their voices, Ethan's laugh, Connor's banter, Doc Carter's instructions. But they're just memories, faint and fading. I'm haunted, yeah, but not by ghosts. It's the silence that kills me. A couple of weeks ago, I found an old photo in my pack. The team, all of us grinning like idiots, arms slung around each other, dirt smudged on our faces. I stared at it for hours, trying to make peace with what I couldn't change. I buried that photo in the Elmwood Hills behind my house, planted a tree over it. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed something to grow from all this death. Life goes on, they say. Maybe it does, but for me it's less about living and more about surviving one day at a time. Because that's what they'd want. Because it's all I know. I was finally home, but the sadness followed me every step of the way. One day it all changed in a single moment. The coffee was terrible, bitter, burnt, but it was hot and it kept my hands busy, so I drank it anyway. The cafe was one of those places with mismatched furniture and overpriced pastries, the kind that made you wonder why you bothered. I came here because it was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt manageable. I sat in the corner, facing the door. Old habits die hard. The world outside moved on without me. People shuffling by, laughing, living. Then they walked in. 3 of them. Something was off right away. You could see it in the way they scanned the room, eyes darting to corners, calculating. They weren't here for coffee. I've seen men like them before. Predators. They moved with purpose, like a pack closing in on prey. I followed their eyes to the target, a man in his 60s, graying hair, sharp suit, sitting calmly at a table by the window. He wasn't alone. 2 guys flanked him, bodyguards, plain as day. Big, burly, with earpieces tucked under their collars. They were alert, but not enough. The 3 men didn't hesitate. The first shot shattered the cafe's fragile calm, and suddenly the world was chaos. The bodyguards moved fast, drawing weapons, but not fast enough. The second shot dropped the guy on the left, blood spraying across the table. The other one lunged, taking a bullet to the chest as he tried to shield the old man. The second bodyguard's pistol hit the floor, sliding across the tiles toward me. Time slowed. I heard screams, chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled for cover. The 3 shooters advanced, pistols raised, aiming for the old man. And there it was, the gun, lying just a few feet from my boot. I didn't think. The first shot was instinct. I picked up the pistol and fired. The recoil was familiar, grounding. The round hit the lead shooter in the chest. He dropped like a sack of bricks, his gun clattering onto the floor. The second guy turned, eyes wide with surprise. He hesitated just long enough for me to put a bullet between his ribs. The third one was smarter. He dove behind a table, using it as cover while he fired blindly in my direction. Splinters flew as the cheap wood exploded near my head. I dropped low, moving around the counter. My heart pounded, the adrenaline sharp and cold, but my hands were steady. It was just like before muscle memory took over. I popped up from behind the counter and fired twice. The first shot missed, punching a hole in the wall behind him. The second hit his shoulder, spinning him sideways. His gun slipped from his hand as he crumpled to the floor, screaming. Silence. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, acrid and heavy. I stood there, the pistol still raised, finger on the trigger, until I realized there was no one left to shoot. The old man was alive, untouched. He stared at me, his face unreadable, while his remaining bodyguard bled out on the floor. People started creeping out from under tables, their eyes wide with fear and gratitude. Someone whispered, "He saved us." I didn't feel like a hero. My ears rang, my chest was tight, and the pistol still felt heavier than it should have. Like the weight of all the lives I'd taken before had returned in that moment. The old man finally spoke, his voice calm, measured. "You have good aim." I didn't answer. He stood, straightening his jacket as if he hadn't just survived an assassination attempt. "You know who I am?" "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "Good," he said, nodding. "But I know who you are, and I owe you my life." I didn't want his gratitude. I didn't want anything. All I wanted was to leave, to disappear back into the shadows where I belonged. But something told me that wasn't going to happen. When the police arrived, I was still there, the pistol on the table in front of me, my hands resting beside it. The old man vouched for me, of course, said I acted in self-defense, saved innocent lives. The cops let me go with a warning about vigilantism. But as I walked out of that cafe, the old man's words lingered in my mind. "I know who you are." He wasn't just talking about my name. He saw the soldier in me, the one I thought I had buried. The call came early, interrupting the quiet morning I'd been trying to enjoy. I almost didn't answer, but something about the number told me it wasn't a telemarketer or an old buddy checking in. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said, calm and clipped. "This is Chief Marcus Grant. I'd like you to come down to the station." It wasn't a request. Chief Grant's office wasn't what I expected. No polished mahogany desk or framed commendations. Just a cluttered space with paperwork spilling over every surface and a coffee mug stained with years of use. Grant himself was a big man in his mid-50s, with a sharp jawline and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Take a seat," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I sat. "You know why you're here?" "No idea," I said, folding my arms. Grant leaned back, studying me like I was a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. "That old man you saved yesterday? His name's Victor Hale." The name hit like a punch to the gut. I'd heard of Victor Hale. Anyone who spent enough time on this side of the law had. He wasn't just any mob boss. He was the mob boss. A ghost in a suit and a smile impossible to pin down. Cops whispered his name with a mix of fear and frustration. Grant sighed, rubbing his temples. "He's my brother." Of all the things he could have said, that was the last I expected. For a while, we just sat there, the silence heavy. Finally, he broke it. "Victor and I don't see eye to eye," Grant said. "Haven't for years. I've spent most of my career trying to put him behind bars. Every time I get close, he slips through. Lack of evidence, witnesses disappearing, Jury's too scared to convict. You name it. I didn't say anything. What could I say? But now, he continued, you've changed the game. You saved his life, Carter. His voice was heavy with meaning. Victor doesn't let that kind of thing slide. He's old school. He'll feel like he owes you. And trust me, he'll try to repay that debt. Money, favors, maybe even a job. I shifted in my seat, the weight of his words settling in. I don't want his money or his favors, I said. I figured as much, Grant replied, which is why I'm offering you something else. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. Join the department. I blinked, caught off guard. What? You're a soldier, he said, his voice firm. You've got skills we need, discipline, instinct, the ability to handle situations most people would run from. And with Victor sniffing around, you're going to need allies. I can give you that. I stared at him, trying to gauge his angle. Why me? Because you've already made an enemy of the kind of people I've spent my life fighting, Grant said. And whether you like it or not, you're in the middle of this now. You saved Victor, but you didn't join his world. That makes you a threat. He let that sink in before continuing. Victor might try to bring you in, but if you say no, he won't just let you walk away, not without a fight. Joining the department gives you protection and a purpose. I sat there weighing my options. The idea of putting on a badge didn't sit right with me. I wasn't a cop. Hell, I wasn't even sure I was a soldier anymore. But Grant wasn't wrong. Victor Hale wouldn't forget me, and the last thing I needed was a mob boss breathing down my neck. Still, joining the police felt like trading one war for another. What happens if I say no? I asked. Grant's jaw tightened. Then you're on your own. I left his office without giving him an answer. The streets felt different as I walked back to my truck. Heavier. Somehow. The choices in front of me weren't great: align myself with the law and get dragged into Grant's war with his brother, or risk Victor's gratitude turning into something far more dangerous. One thing was clear: my quiet, bitter coffee mornings were over. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what my next move would be. The knock on my door wasn't unexpected. By the time I reached for it, I already knew who would be standing there. No one else knocks that calmly, that deliberately, especially after a day like I'd had. I opened it to see Victor Hale, sharp as ever, his tailored suit looking out of place on my worn front porch. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice smooth and disarming, like a lion purring before the pounce. I hope I'm not intruding. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a younger man, early 30s, tall, athletic build, with the same sharp features and piercing eyes as Victor. His son, no doubt. He carried a leather bag in one hand, casual, as if it were gym gear. But I knew better. Evening, I said, stepping aside. Come in. They didn't waste time. Victor sat at my kitchen table, the air around him commanding attention. His son, Logan, placed the bag gently on the table and stood by his father's shoulder, silent and watchful. I hear you had a conversation with my brother today, Victor began, folding his hands neatly. I didn't answer, just watched him, waiting. No need to explain, he continued, waving a hand as if to dismiss the thought. I know Marcus means well, but he's, let's just say, misguided in his approach. Still, it's clear you're a man of principle. That's why I'm here. He nodded to Logan, who unzipped the bag and tilted it forward, letting me see the stacks of cash inside. $250,000, Victor said, just to join us. More to come if you prove yourself. I didn't even look at the money. You think I'd take a bribe? I asked, my voice flat. Not a bribe, Mr. Carter, Victor said, leaning back. An opportunity. You've seen how this world works. Men like my brother wear badges, but their hands are just as dirty as anyone's. I offer something different: power, freedom, and loyalty. Real loyalty. I shook my head. Not interested. Logan finally spoke, his voice quieter than I expected but firm. You should think about it, Carter. It's not just about the money. It's about family, respect. Family? I repeated the word, tasting the bitterness in it. Victor smiled, slow and knowing. You've been through hell, Mr. Carter. I respect that, and I respect your decision, whatever it may be. But I'd be remiss if I didn't make this offer. I stood, leaning on the back of my chair, my gaze steady. I'm joining the department, I said firmly. Grant might not be perfect, but at least he's fighting to do the right thing. I won't be your soldier, Victor. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Victor stood, smoothing his jacket with a practiced motion. You're a brave man, Carter, he said, his tone almost admiring. I knew that the moment I saw you handle those men, and I respect bravery above all else. He extended a hand, and after a moment, I took it. His grip was strong, unyielding. If you ever change your mind, he said, his voice low, you know where to find me. And if you ever need help, real help, don't hesitate to call. I'll be there. Logan stepped forward next, his handshake warmer than his father's. You made your choice, he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I respect that. You've got the heart of a brother, even if we're on different sides. Don't be a stranger, Carter. He turned to the bag of money, zipping it shut without a trace of disappointment. It was all a game to them, an offer made and refused with no hard feelings, or at least none they showed. As they left, Victor paused in the doorway, glancing back over his shoulder. Take care of yourself, Mr. Carter. This world needs men like you, no matter which side you're on. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone in the quiet again. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot where the bag of cash had been. $250,000 could have changed a lot, bought me time, comfort, maybe even peace, but it wouldn't have bought my soul. Victor and Logan meant what they said, I could tell, but loyalty to them came with a price I wasn't willing to pay. I'd drawn my line in the sand, and I had no illusions about how hard it would be to keep it. Still, as I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat back at the table, one thought kept running through my mind: the war wasn't over. It had just changed fronts. Life on the force wasn't what I expected. I traded my fatigues for a badge, and while the rhythm was different, the stakes were the same. Every day was a new challenge, and every call was a gamble. But I wasn't in it for the adrenaline anymore. I was in it to find purpose, maybe even redemption. That's how I ended up at the scene of an accident one rainy evening. The call came in as I was finishing a shift. A car had veered off the road, skidded down an embankment, and slammed into a tree. By the time I got there, the rain was relentless, turning the roadside into a muddy mess. The car was crumpled, the hood folded in on itself like an accordion. Inside was a woman, unconscious but breathing, her face streaked with blood from a gash on her forehead. Ma'am, I'm Officer Carter, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I worked to free her from the wreckage. I'm getting you out of here. She stirred slightly, groaning, her eyes fluttering open. Even in that moment, her beauty struck me. Soft features, long dark hair, and a strength in her expression that belied her current state. The paramedics arrived just as I managed to get her out. They whisked her to the hospital and I followed behind, making sure she was stable and her paperwork was in order. It wasn't protocol, but something about her stayed with me. When I finally saw her awake in the hospital bed, bandaged but alert, she gave me a weak smile. Thanks for saving me, she said, her voice soft but steady. Just doing my job, I replied. Some job, she said with a small laugh. I'm Hannah Blake. Nice to meet you, Hannah, I said, feeling a pull I hadn't felt in years. A few days later, when she was discharged, I stopped by to check on her. She was grateful, surprised I'd gone out of my way. We talked for a while, and before I knew it, the words slipped out. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. I'd like that. One day turned into 2, then 3. Weeks passed in a blur of late-night conversations, shared meals, and the kind of laughter I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Hannah had a way of making everything feel lighter, easier, like the world wasn't such a dark place after all. She moved in a few months later. It wasn't something I planned, it just happened naturally, like everything else with her. My quiet house, once filled only with echoes and the weight of memories, suddenly felt alive. We'd sit on the couch at night, her head on my shoulder, talking about everything and nothing. She asked me about my time in the army, about the scars I carried, both the ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, I wanted to. Chief Grant never called me into his office unless it was serious. So when I heard my name crackle over the precinct's intercom one afternoon, I felt a knot tighten in my gut. I knocked twice before stepping inside. Grant was behind his desk, arms crossed, his expression a mix of curiosity and something harder to pin down. Close the door, Carter, he said, his voice steady but firm. I complied, the weight of his tone hanging heavy in the air. Have a seat, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. You're doing good work here, Carter, Grant began, leaning back slightly, his eyes studying me. I trust you. That's why I need to ask you something. Off the record. I tensed but nodded. Go ahead. Why are you living with Hannah Blake? The question caught me off guard. My first instinct was to defend her, but something about his tone made me pause. Because I love her, I said simply, keeping my gaze steady. Grant sighed, rubbing his temple. That's not what I meant. Do you know who she is? I frowned, confused. What are you getting at? Hannah Blake, he said slowly, as if weighing each word, is Hannah Hale, Victor Hale's daughter. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. I felt like I'd been hit by one of those grenades I used to dodge overseas. Blown back but still standing. That's not possible, I said, my voice low. Grant leaned forward, his eyes sharp. She uses her mother's last name, probably to distance herself. But make no mistake, Carter. She's one of them. I left his office in a daze, Grant's words echoing in my head. By the time I got home that evening, my mind was racing with questions. Hannah was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. She turned and smiled when she saw me. Hey, she said, walking over to kiss me. But I stepped back, and the smile faded from her face. What's wrong? Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. Why didn't you tell me who your father is? Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then her shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this moment. I was going to tell you, she said softly, but I didn't know how. And then things got so serious between us, and I was scared it would change everything. You lied to me, Hannah, I said, the betrayal cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I trusted you. I didn't lie, she countered, her voice trembling but firm. I just didn't tell you because it doesn't matter, Carter. I'm not part of that life. I left when I was 18 and haven't looked back since. She sat down at the table, her hands clasped tightly together. Do you know what it was like growing up in that house? Watching my father manipulate everyone around him? Seeing my brother idolize him like he was some kind of king? I hated it. I hated him. And the moment I was old enough, I left. Her voice cracked, and I saw the pain in her eyes. I've spent every day trying to be my own person, to leave that name behind. That's why I use my mom's name, because Victor Hale doesn't define me. I sat down across from her, my anger softening into something closer to understanding. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Because I didn't want you to look at me like you are now, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. Like I'm some kind of stranger. I'm not him, Carter. I never will be. The silence between us was heavy, but finally, I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. I believe you, Hannah, but you should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry. Over the next few months, we rebuilt the trust that had been shaken. Hannah proved time and again that she was nothing like her father, and I realized that whatever baggage she carried wasn't her fault. She was stronger than she gave herself credit for, and loving her was the easiest thing I'd ever done. 6 months later, we stood in front of a small gathering of friends and family, Grant included, as we exchanged vows. When Hannah said, I do, it wasn't just a promise. It was a declaration, a line drawn between her past and the future we were building together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd found a place where I truly belonged. The first thing you learn on the Force is that chaos doesn't wait for you to catch up. It hits hard and fast, and it doesn't care if you're ready. I wasn't the kind of guy to hesitate, though. Maybe it was my time in the army, or maybe it was just who I was. Either way, when things got violent, I was the one they called. Every operation brought back flashes of the past. The tension in the air, the way time seemed to slow just before everything exploded into motion. But now, instead of enemy combatants, it was armed robbers, gang members, or desperate people with nothing to lose. And instead of my brothers in arms, it was my fellow officers relying on me to keep them safe. One night, we got a call about a hostage situation at a convenience store. A guy, strung out on something, had a clerk and 2 customers at gunpoint. By the time we arrived, the street was already swarming with squad cars and panicked bystanders. Carter, you're up, Sergeant Collins said, nodding toward the building. I grabbed a ballistic shield and my sidearm, my mind already mapping out the angles, the exits, the potential threats. As I approached the store, I could hear the guy shouting, his voice a mix of anger and fear. Through the glass door, I saw him pacing, waving the gun around like it was an extension of his arm. "Hey!" I called out, my voice steady and loud. "I'm Officer Carter. Let's talk." His eyes locked on me, wild and erratic. "Stay back!" he screamed, the gun trembling in his hand. "I'm not coming any closer," I said, keeping my tone calm. "But you don't want to do this. Let's figure this out together. All right?" Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I talked him down. I kept my movements slow, my words deliberate, chipping away at his defenses. Finally, he lowered the gun. As the hostages ran out, I moved in, securing the weapon and taking him into custody. Another crisis averted. Another life saved. Not every situation ended so cleanly. Sometimes, violence was the only language a perpetrator understood, and I had to speak it fluently. One day, we were called to a domestic disturbance. A man with a history of violence had barricaded himself in his house with his wife and kids. When negotiations failed, we breached the door. He came at us with a knife, wild-eyed and ready to kill. I was the first one through, and in the split second he lunged, I reacted, disarming him and subduing him before anyone got hurt. The adrenaline hit me like a freight train, but when I looked at the terrified faces of his family, I knew it was worth it. Word spread quickly about how I handled myself in the field. Officers started looking to me whenever things went sideways, trusting me to be the calm in the storm. Civilians, too, began recognizing me. Whether it was a woman thanking me for saving her son or a store owner shaking my hand after I stopped a robbery, their gratitude reminded me why I'd chosen this path. But there were nights when the weight of it all felt like too much. Nights when I'd come home, my knuckles sore and my mind racing, and Hannah would be waiting for me. She didn't ask questions, didn't push. She just sat with me, her presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. The job wasn't easy, but I wasn't looking for easy. I was looking for purpose, for a way to turn my past into something that mattered. And every time I stepped into the chaos, every time I brought someone home alive, I felt like I was doing just that. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Drawing a line between chaos and order and standing firm when no one else could. When Hannah told me she was pregnant, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. In all the chaos of my life, war, violence, rebuilding, I'd never imagined this moment. The idea of bringing a child into the world, of being a father, filled me with a mix of excitement and fear. The months that followed tested me in ways I wasn't prepared for. Hannah's mood swings came fast and hard, like a storm rolling in without warning. One minute she'd be smiling, her hands cradling her belly as she talked about baby names. The next, she'd be furious over something as small as me forgetting to put the cap back on the toothpaste. At first, I tried to reason with her, to explain myself, but it only made things worse. So, I learned to endure, to let her vent without taking it personally. Some nights she'd sit on the couch, crying over a commercial or a sad scene in a movie. I'd sit beside her, holding her hand, reassuring her that everything would be okay. Other nights, she lashed out, calling me stubborn or cold because I didn't respond the way she wanted. "You don't care, do you?" she snapped one night after I came home late from a shift. "I care more than you know," I said, keeping my voice steady even though I was bone-tired. "But this job, it doesn't wait. And neither do you and the baby. I'm doing my best, Hannah." She glared at me for a moment. Then her expression softened. "I know," she said quietly, tears pooling in her eyes. I feel like I'm losing my mind." I pulled her into my arms, kissing the top of her head. "You're not. You're just carrying our whole world inside you." The night it happened, I was coming off a double shift. My feet ached, and my mind was foggy. But the second I saw Hannah clutching her belly, I was wide awake. "It's time," she said, her voice trembling but determined. I grabbed the hospital bag we'd packed weeks ago and helped her to the car. The drive felt like a blur, half frantic, half surreal. Hannah was breathing heavily beside me, gripping my hand so tightly I thought she might break it. When we got to the hospital, it was like stepping into a war zone. But this time, the stakes were higher than anything I'd ever faced. Nurses and doctors moved with precision, guiding Hannah into a room while I tried to stay calm. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice strained. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, holding her hand as the contractions came and went like waves crashing against a shoreline. Hours passed, each one dragging slower than the last. Hannah screamed, cursed, cried. Everything she had. I wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, whispered encouragement, and held her hand through it all, even when she crushed my fingers. And then, finally, the sound I'd been waiting for, a cry, small and piercing, cutting through the tension in the room. "It's a boy," the doctor said, holding up the tiny, wriggling baby before placing him on Hannah's chest. Hannah was sobbing, her face flushed and exhausted, but her eyes shone with pure joy as she looked down at our son. I stood there, frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of them together. "Do you want to hold him?" Hannah asked, her voice soft and full of wonder. I hesitated, my hands trembling. "Maybe in a little while," I said quietly. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and understanding. "Whenever you're ready," she whispered, her focus returning to the baby. Hannah and the baby came home 2 days later. My father, John Carter, was already waiting at the house to meet his grandson. He held the baby carefully, a rare softness in his usually rugged demeanor. After a few minutes, he handed the baby back to Hannah and motioned for me to follow him outside. "Handsome kid," he said, his voice soft. Then his tone shifted, cautious. "Butch, are you sure?" I knew exactly what he was asking. Without responding, I gestured for him to follow me to the porch. Once we were out of earshot, I crossed my arms and leaned against the railing. "I've been asking myself that same question," I admitted, keeping my voice low. "Ever since I saw him, I've had my doubts. But I didn't say anything because there's nothing to say. Not yet." My dad's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. "And now?" I glanced toward the house, collecting my thoughts. "Now I'm waiting, watching. The timing's not perfect, I'll admit. And the baby," I hesitated. "He doesn't look like me, not entirely. But I'm not going to jump to conclusions and tear my family apart without proof." John nodded slowly, his face a mix of concern and understanding. "And Hannah? Has she said anything to make you think?" I shook my head. "No, she's acted like nothing's wrong. But if there's something she's hiding, I'll find out. I've been down too many roads to ignore my gut, but I need to tread carefully. If I confront her without proof, it could blow up in my face. And I'm not about to walk out on this little boy without knowing the truth." He studied me for a moment, his expression softening. "You're a good man, Butch. A lesser guy would have lost it by now." I smirked bitterly. "Being patient doesn't mean I'm not angry, Dad. If there's betrayal here, it cuts deep. But I've learned to keep my emotions in check, at least until the time's right." He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve the truth, son. Whatever it is, you'll handle it. You always do." "Yeah," I said, my jaw tightening. "One way or another, I'll get to the bottom of it." Back inside, Hannah was on the couch, cradling the baby and humming softly. She looked up at me with tired but happy eyes. I forced a smile, locking my doubts away for the moment. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, not yet. That night, after Hannah and the baby were asleep, I called Chief Grant. His voice was groggy when he answered, but he didn't sound surprised. "You need something, Carter?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice low. "I need a paternity test." Quietly, there was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "You sure about this?" "No," I admitted. "But I need answers, Nate. I can't live with this doubt." "All right," he said. "I'll make the arrangements. But you'd better be prepared for whatever the results say." "I will be," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The next few days were a blur of routine and restless nights. I worked my shifts, came home, and played the part of a happy husband and father. All the while, my mind churned with possibilities. What if the baby wasn't mine? What if Hannah had been lying to me all along? And what would I do if it turned out my suspicions were right? The test results came back a week later. Chief Grant called me into his office, the envelope sitting on his desk like a loaded gun. He handed it to me without a word, his expression unreadable. I stared at it for a long moment before finally tearing it open. My eyes scanned the document, the words blurring together until I found the one phrase I'd been searching for: probability of paternity 99.99%. Relief hit me like a freight train, followed quickly by guilt. I doubted her. I doubted my son. And for what? A hunch? A flicker of uncertainty? I leaned back in the chair, letting out a long breath. "He's mine," I said quietly. Grant nodded. "Good. Now you can put this behind you." But could I? The doubt had left a crack in our foundation, one I wasn't sure could be easily repaired. And the fact that I'd even gone through with the test felt like a betrayal in itself. That night, I sat on the porch, staring out at the darkened hills. Hannah came out after a while, the baby monitor in her hand. She sat beside me, her gaze searching mine. "You've been distant," she said softly. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then decided there was no point in lying. I had doubts, I admitted. About him. About you. Her face fell, a mix of hurt and anger flashing in her eyes. "You thought he wasn't yours?" I had to be sure, I said, my voice steady. I couldn't live with the doubt. "And now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's mine," I said. The test confirmed it. Hannah stood abruptly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't believe you did this, Carter. I can't believe you didn't trust me." "I wanted to," I said, standing to face her. "But after everything I've been through, trust doesn't come easy. You know that." She shook her head, wiping at her tears. "I can't do this right now." She walked back inside, leaving me alone on the porch. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than any I'd carried before. The days that followed were tense. Hannah and I spoke only when necessary. The once warm and easy conversations replaced with clipped words and heavy silences. I tried to give her space, hoping time would ease the sting of my actions. But the distance between us only seemed to grow. Couldn't blame her. I crossed a line, and rebuilding the trust I'd broken wasn't going to be easy. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. Not on her, not on us, not on the family we'd started building together. One night, after putting the baby to bed, I found her sitting on the couch, staring at an old photo album. Her fingers traced the edges of a picture. A younger version of herself with her mother, a small smile on her lips. I sat down beside her, the silence between us heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Do you even know what it's like to be constantly doubted? To have people look at you and only see where you came from?" I didn't answer right away. I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about the weight of her father's name, the shadow she'd been living under her entire life. "I don't doubt you," I said eventually. "I doubted myself, my instincts, my ability to trust. That's on me, Hannah, not you." She turned to face me, her eyes red but fierce. "You should have come to me. You should have talked to me instead of going behind my back." "I know," I said, my voice soft. "And I'm sorry. I should have trusted you enough to handle it together. I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right. Tell me how." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she sighed and leaned back against the couch. "You can start by not keeping things from me anymore. No more secrets, no more second-guessing. If we're going to make this work, we have to be honest with each other." "Agreed," I said, my voice steady. No more secrets. The weeks that followed were slow but steady. Hannah and I worked to rebuild what had been shaken piece by piece. We started talking again. Not just about the day-to-day, but about the deeper things, the fears and doubts that had been lurking beneath the surface. Through it all, I couldn't help but marvel at her strength. She wasn't just surviving her past. She was determined to rise above it, to build a life that was hers and hers alone. And as I watched her with our son, the love and patience she poured into him, I realized just how lucky I was to have her by my side. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, she reached over and took my hand. "Do you think he'll ever try to come back into our lives?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Victor Hale had been silent since the wedding. No calls, no surprise visits, nothing. But his absence was as loud as his presence had once been, a constant reminder of the world she'd left behind. "If he does, he'll have to get through me first," I said firmly. "And he knows that." She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. "I just want him to have a better life than I did," she said, glancing toward the window where the faint glow of the baby monitor light flickered. "He will, I promised, because he has you." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace settle over us. Life on the force continued to test me. Every call, every case brought new challenges. But now, instead of feeling like I was fighting alone, I knew I had something worth coming home to, something worth fighting for. My family, my future. One night, I was called to a robbery in progress at a local jewelry store. By the time I arrived, the suspects were barricaded inside, hostages trembling in fear. It was a tense standoff, the kind that could go south in an instant. But as I negotiated with the suspects, my mind was calm, my focus sharp. I thought of Hannah and our son, of the life I wanted to protect, and it gave me the clarity I needed to bring the situation to a peaceful end. When I got home that night, exhausted but unscathed, Hannah was waiting for me. She didn't say anything, just pulled me into a hug, holding on like she never wanted to let go. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. 6 months later, we celebrated our son's first birthday. It was a small gathering, just close friends and a few of my colleagues from the precinct. Chief Grant showed up with a gift, a rare smile on his usually stoic face. As I watched Hannah laugh with our guests, her smile brighter than I'd ever seen it, I realized just how far we'd come. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. That's the story. What do you think about it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. See you in the next one.